A young waitress with a threadbare coat asked a stranger in first class if he could hold her hand during takeoff, her voice trembling with fear. The man beside her, dressed in an immaculate suit with tired eyes, simply nodded and took her cold, shaking hand in his. She never knew that the wealthy CEO hadn't held anyone's hand in 3 years, not since his 7-year-old daughter had slipped away in a hospital bed, her small fingers going limp in his palm. And he never knew that this scared girl, who apologized for bothering him, had just spent her last dollar on this flight to see her dying grandmother one final time. Neither could have imagined that this simple gesture at 30,000 feet would unravel both their carefully guarded hearts and lead them toward the healing they'd both stopped believing in. Emma Walsh's hands trembled as she counted the bills for the 3rd time, spreading them across the chipped laminate counter of her studio apartment. $347. It was everything. Every tip carefully folded and tucked away. Every extra shift she had worked at Morrison's Diner over the past 2 months. Every dollar she had planned to use for next semester's textbooks when she finally saved enough to enroll in the nursing program at Seattle Community College. The money sat there like a fragile promise, and she was about to break it. The phone call had come at 2 in the morning. 3 days ago, a nurse named Patricia with a kind but heavy voice had said the words Emma had been dreading for months. "Your grandmother's condition has deteriorated significantly. If you want to see her, you should come soon." Soon. Such a gentle word for something so urgent, so final. Margaret Walsh had raised Emma from the age of 6 after the car accident that took both her parents on a rain-slicked highway outside Tacoma. Her grandmother had been a secretary then, already in her 50s, suddenly responsible for a traumatized little girl with nightmares and questions no one could answer. Margaret had held her through every tear, worked past retirement to keep them fed, taught her that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but how you treated people when you had nothing left to give. Now Margaret was in a hospital bed in Boston, her body finally surrendering to the congestive heart failure she had hidden from Emma for nearly a year. Emma looked around her apartment, barely 300 square feet. With its leaking faucet, she fixed herself with YouTube tutorials and the space heater that only worked if you kicked it twice. The threadbare coat hanging by the door had been her mother's once. She wore it every day. Her uniforms from the diner hung in the closet, smelling perpetually of coffee and bacon grease, no matter how many times she washed them. This was her life. Small, simple, and hers. She had been so close to climbing out, so close to becoming the nurse she dreamed of being. But some decisions made themselves. Emma picked up her phone and booked the cheapest flight to Boston, watching her bank account drop to $17.63. She would figure out the rest later. She always did. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. James Hartwell stood in the first-class lounge at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, staring through floor-to-ceiling windows at planes lifting into an October sky that looked as gray as he felt. His suit was bespoke, charcoal wool that cost more than most people made in a month, tailored to perfection by a man in Milan who knew his measurements by heart. His watch was Swiss, complicated, worth a small fortune. Everything about him screamed success, power, control. Everything except his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had stopped sleeping through the night 3 years ago and never started again. His assistant, Marcus Chen, stood beside him with a tablet, scrolling through the itinerary with practiced efficiency. The board meeting starts at 2. Donovan and his team will be pushing for the merger again, so I've prepared counterpoints. Your hotel is the Fairmont. I've arranged for the car service to take you directly from Logan. The quarterly reports are in your briefcase, and I've flagged the sections that need your attention. James heard the words as if from underwater. He nodded mechanically, his gaze still fixed on the planes. Marcus had been his assistant for 7 years. He had watched James build Hartwell Technologies into a giant in cybersecurity, had watched him become a billionaire before 40, had watched him lose everything that mattered. "Mr. Hartwell?" Marcus's voice softened. "Do you want me to come with you to Boston?" "No," James said quietly. "I'll handle it." Handle it? He handled everything now. Board meetings, acquisitions, investor calls, the endless machinery of building an empire that meant absolutely nothing. His penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle had 23 rooms and felt like a mausoleum. His ex-wife, Catherine, had taken the house in Medina, the one with Claire's room still intact, still painted lavender with glow in the dark stars on the ceiling. They had signed the divorce papers 18 months ago, sitting across from each other at a lawyer's office, two strangers who had once created a perfect little girl and then couldn't bear to look at each other after she was gone. The leukemia had taken Claire in 14 months. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctors had said, using words that sounded clinical and cold for something that burned through their lives like wildfire. She had been 7 years old, gap-toothed and brilliant, obsessed with dinosaurs and strawberry ice cream. James had held her hand through every treatment, every terrible night, until the very end. And then he had let go. And he hadn't really held on to anything since. Emma had only flown once in her life. When she was 9 years old, and her grandmother had scraped together enough money to take her to Disneyland for her birthday. She remembered gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles turned white. Convinced the metal tube hurtling through clouds would simply fall from the sky. The fear had never left. Now, standing in the airport with her small duffel bag and her mother's old coat, she felt that same terror coiling in her stomach like a living thing. The flight she could afford left at 6:15 in the evening, hours later than the morning flights, but $200 cheaper. Time was a luxury she couldn't buy. She clutched her grandmother's rosary in her pocket, the wooden beads worn smooth from decades of Margaret's prayers. It was the only thing of value she owned, and she ran her thumb over it repeatedly, finding comfort in the familiar grooves. When she checked in, the agent had looked at her ticket, frowned at the computer screen, then smiled. "Miss Walsh, there's been an upgrade to your reservation. You're in first class, seat 2A. Emma had blinked, certain there was a mistake. "I didn't pay for first class. I can't afford." "No charge, ma'am. System error in our favor. Enjoy your flight." Now, Emma stood at the entrance to the first-class lounge, feeling like an imposter in a museum. Everyone around her wore expensive clothes, spoke in low, confident voices, carried leather briefcases and designer luggage. She looked down at her duffel bag with its fraying strap, her worn sneakers, her coat with the missing button she kept meaning to replace. A woman in a cream cashmere sweater glanced at her, and Emma saw the quick assessment, the subtle dismissal. She found a seat in the corner, trying to make herself small. A server came by, offering champagne and sparkling water. Emma whispered her request for water, feeling her cheeks burn. She didn't belong here. These people flew first class like she took the bus. They probably had portfolios and stock options and summer homes. She had $17 in her checking account and a grandmother dying 3,000 miles away. But as she sat there, watching the sky darken through the windows, she felt a flicker of gratitude. At least in first class, there would be more space, more room to breathe through the panic, seats that didn't press against her on all sides. She wouldn't have to face her fear trapped between strangers in a cramped row. It was a small mercy, but she would take it. Emma walked down the jetway with her heart already racing, the rosary beads digging into her palm through her pocket. The flight attendant greeted her with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Emma managed a weak smile in return before making her way into the cabin. First class was a different world. Wide leather seats, warm lighting, space that felt almost obscene compared to the economy section she glimpsed behind the curtain. She found row 2 and stopped. Seat 2A. Window seat. Her throat tightened. She would be trapped against the wall, watching the ground fall away beneath her. The man in seat 2B was already settled, his presence commanding even in stillness. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and his fingers moved across a laptop keyboard with the efficient precision of someone who turned minutes into money. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he hadn't relaxed in years. He didn't look up as she approached. Emma hesitated, clutching her duffel bag. "Excuse me, I'm in the window seat." He glanced up briefly, his eyes a startling blue but distant, somewhere far beyond her. He stood without a word, stepping into the aisle to let her pass, his movements polite but mechanical. She squeezed by him, hyper-aware of the space, of his expensive cologne, of how out of place she was. She shoved her bag under the seat in front of her and sat down, immediately feeling the walls close in. The man returned to his seat, to his laptop, building an invisible barrier between them with his silence. Emma tried to steady her breathing. She buckled her seatbelt, then checked it twice, then 3 times. Her hands were already trembling. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration, pointing out exits and oxygen masks, and Emma's mind turned each instruction into a catastrophe. Exits meant crashes. Oxygen masks meant cabin depressurization. She closed her eyes and gripped the armrests. The engines began to whine, that terrible sound that meant they were preparing to move, preparing to defy gravity with nothing but metal and faith. Her breathing quickened. She could feel her pulse in her throat, and then she looked at the man beside her. He had closed his laptop now, his attention somewhere in the middle distance, his expression carved from stone. But there was something about him, something solid and unshakable despite the coldness. His hands rested on the armrests, steady and strong, hands that looked like they had held things worth holding. Emma turned to him as the plane began to push back from the gate, her voice barely above a whisper, shaking like the rest of her. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could you hold my hand during takeoff? I'm terrified of flying." The words tumbled out in a rush, and she immediately regretted them. Seeing herself through his eyes, this strange girl in a worn coat asking for comfort from a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with anyone. James turned to look at her fully for the first time, and she watched something shift behind those blue eyes. For a moment, he seemed startled, as if she had reached across an invisible wall he had spent years building, and rattled it with her bare hands. His gaze dropped to her trembling fingers, white-knuckled against the armrest, and she saw his expression change, saw something flicker there that looked like pain, like memory, like a door opening in a abandoned house. His jaw tightened and his own hand flexed against the armrest, and for a heartbeat she thought he would refuse, would turn away and leave her to face her fear alone. But then he nodded, just once, and reached out his hand. Emma took it without hesitation, her cold fingers folding into his warm palm, and the relief that flooded through her was so immediate and overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. His hand was strong, steady, exactly what she needed, and he held hers with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about his closed-off demeanor. The plane turned onto the runway and the engines roared to life. That terrible sound that made her stomach drop. But she held tight to this stranger's hand and felt anchored. She didn't see the way his breath caught, didn't see the way his eyes closed briefly as if against a wave of grief. James felt the small, cold hand in his, and something cracked open in his chest, something he had welded shut 3 years ago when he let go of another small hand for the last time. This girl's fingers trembled against his palm, seeking safety, seeking comfort, and his body remembered what to do even though his heart had forgotten. He found himself squeezing gently, reassuringly, his thumb moving across her knuckles in an old, instinctive pattern. It was the first real human touch he had allowed himself in longer than he could remember, and it hurt and healed in the same breath. The plane accelerated down the runway and Emma squeezed her eyes shut, her grip on the stranger's hand tightening until she was certain she was hurting him. But he didn't pull away. The wheels left the ground and her stomach lurched. The terrible sensation of defying nature, of being suspended in nothing but air and hope. She focused on the hand holding hers, on the warmth of it, the solidness. And she felt his thumb begin to move across her knuckles in slow, gentle strokes, back and forth, a rhythm that was soothing and sad all at once. James didn't realize he was doing it at first, this small gesture of comfort that his body remembered, even though his mind had tried to forget. It was exactly how he used to calm Claire during her treatments, during the long nights when she was scared and small, and holding onto him like he could save her. The muscle memory of love still alive in his hands, even when the rest of him felt dead. The plane climbed, and slowly the roar of the engine settled into a steady hum. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Emma opened her eyes and looked down at their joined hands, suddenly aware that they were still holding on, that the danger had passed, but neither of them had let go. Her cheeks flushed crimson and she released his hand quickly, pulling back as if she had been caught stealing. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hold on that long. Thank you, really, thank you so much. I know that was probably so uncomfortable for you, and I'm sorry." The words tumbled out in an anxious stream, and James found himself doing something he hadn't done in months. He almost smiled. "It's fine," he said quietly, and his voice was softer than it had been in years. "I'm James." She looked at him with eyes that were kind and grateful, and saw him as a person. Not a CEO, not a machine in an expensive suit. "Emma," she said, offering a small, genuine smile that carried warmth like sunlight through a window. "Emma Walsh. Thank you again. I feel ridiculous, but flying just terrifies me." "Where are you headed?" he asked, surprising himself with the question, with the fact that he cared about the answer. "Boston. To see my grandmother." There was something in the way she said it, a weight behind the words, that made him look at her more closely. And Emma found herself talking to this stranger because something about him, despite his sadness, felt safe. Emma looked out the window at the clouds below, her fingers still tingling from where his hand had held hers. And she felt the words rising in her throat, the words she hadn't said out loud to anyone because there was no one to tell. "She's sick, really sick. The hospital called 3 days ago and said I should come soon if I wanted to see her." Her voice wavered and she blinked rapidly, tears gathering in her eyes that she tried to hold back. "I'm terrified I won't make it in time. This was the only flight I could afford, and it leaves so late. And what if she—" She stopped, swallowing hard, then forced a smile that was brave and broken all at once. "Sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You're just very easy to talk to." James felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something that might have been empathy, might have been recognition of pain that mirrored his own. "Tell me about her," he heard himself say, and he meant it. Emma's face transformed, grief giving way to love so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Her name is Margaret. She raised me after my parents died when I was 6. She was already in her 50s, already tired. But she took me in without hesitation and gave me everything she had. She worked until she was 70 so I could have school clothes and birthday cakes and a chance at something better. She taught me that being poor doesn't mean being small. That dignity is about how you treat people, especially when you have nothing left to give." The tears fell now, but she smiled through them, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "She's the best person I've ever known." "What do you do?" James asked, leaning slightly toward her, his laptop forgotten, his walls crumbling brick by brick. "I'm a waitress. At Morrison's Diner in Seattle. I work double shifts most days." She said it without shame, with quiet dignity, exactly as her grandmother had taught her. "I've been saving to go back to school for nursing. I want to help people the way the nurses helped my grandmother, the way they treated her with kindness when she was scared. But this trip, it took everything I'd saved." She looked at him with eyes that held no self-pity, only acceptance. "It was worth it, though. She's worth everything." Emma noticed his hands as he gestured while speaking, strong hands with long fingers, and she saw the pale band of skin on his left ring finger, where a wedding band had once lived. The tan line was still visible, a ghost of commitment that his body hadn't forgotten even if he had removed the ring. She hesitated, then spoke gently. "The way you might approach a wounded animal. Are you married?" James looked down at his hand, at the evidence he couldn't erase, and something passed across his face that looked like old pain worn smooth by time. "Not anymore." The words were quiet, final, and Emma heard everything he didn't say in the space between them. She didn't ask when or why or how, didn't pry into wounds that were clearly still tender. She simply nodded and said with genuine kindness, "I'm sorry." Those 2 words, offered without judgment or curiosity, without the weight of expectation, did something to James. He found himself wanting to say more, to fill the silence with truths he hadn't spoken in years. I have a company. Technology. I travel constantly for work, meetings, and acquisitions. And things that used to matter. He paused, his jaw working as he chose his words carefully. Life is complicated, or maybe I made it complicated. I'm not sure anymore. Emma listened the way her grandmother had taught her to listen, with her whole attention, without planning what to say next or trying to fix what was broken. What kind of technology? She asked, not because she understood technology, but because she understood that sometimes people needed to talk about safe things before they could talk about real things. Cybersecurity. We protect data, build firewalls, prevent breaches. He said it mechanically, as if describing someone else's life. It's important work, I suppose. It keeps me busy. Busy can be good, Emma said softly, or it can be a way to not think about other things. She said it without accusation, just observation, and James looked at her with something like wonder. This young woman, in a threadbare coat, who saw through him with a clarity that made him feel exposed and somehow safe at the same time. The plane dropped suddenly. A sickening lurch that sent Emma's stomach into her throat and turned her blood to ice. The seatbelt light dinged on and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom about unexpected turbulence. But Emma didn't hear the words, only felt the aircraft shudder and dip like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Her hand shot out instinctively, reaching for James, and he caught it immediately, his fingers lacing through hers without hesitation, without the awkwardness of the first time. He said, his voice low and steady, and she clung to that steadiness like a lifeline. Just turbulence. The plane is built for this. The aircraft bucked again, and Emma squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in short gasps. But James held her hand firmly, and she felt his other hand move, a subtle shift that drew her attention even through her fear. She opened her eyes and looked at him. And that's when she saw it. His left hand was clenched into a tight fist against his thigh, his knuckles bone white with tension, and something small and purple peeked out between his fingers. A hair clip, a child's purple hair clip with a small plastic butterfly on it. Worn and faded as if it had been held many times, carried many miles. James was gripping it so tightly it must have hurt, his whole body rigid with something that went far beyond concern for turbulence. The plane steadied and the shaking subsided, settling back into smooth flight. But James didn't relax, didn't loosen his hold on that small piece of plastic in memory. Emma watched him, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched, the way his eyes stared straight ahead at nothing. She waited until her own breathing calmed, until the terror had retreated enough for her to think clearly. And then she asked very quietly, very gently, "Someone special?" James froze. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, and Emma thought perhaps she had crossed a line, ventured into territory that was forbidden. But then, slowly, he opened his palm, uncurling his fingers one by one to reveal the purple butterfly clip resting in his hand like a small, precious relic. James stared at the clip in his palm. And when he spoke, his voice was barely audible, scraped raw from somewhere deep inside. Her name was Claire. My daughter. She was 7 years old. The past tense hung in the air like smoke, and Emma felt her heart constrict, understanding flooding through her before he said another word. She loved purple. Everything purple. This was her favorite clip. She wore it every day, even when she got sick, even when her hair started falling out from the chemotherapy. His thumb traced the small plastic butterfly, a gesture worn into habit, into ritual. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. 14 months from diagnosis to... He couldn't say the word, couldn't speak it into existence again. I held her hand at the end. In the hospital. Her fingers were so small in mine. And I kept thinking if I just held on tight enough, I could keep her here. But she slipped away anyway, and her hand went limp, and I haven't been able to hold on to anything since. His voice broke on the last words, and tears slid down his face unchecked. The first he had cried in front of another human being since the funeral 3 years ago. "I carry this everywhere because it's all I have left. It still smells like her shampoo if I hold it close enough. Strawberry." She loved strawberry everything. Emma's own tears were falling freely now, her heart breaking for this man beside her, this stranger who had held her hand through her fear while carrying an ocean of grief inside him. She understood now why he had seemed so hollow, why his eyes looked so tired, why that simple gesture of holding her hand had seemed to cost him something. He had been frozen in the moment of letting go, unable to move forward, unable to reach back. She didn't say anything because there were no words sufficient for this kind of loss, no platitudes that could touch this depth of pain. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, the one not holding the clip, and she simply held it, not asking anything of him, not trying to fix what was shattered, just offering the same steady comfort he had given her, her small hand in his, warm and alive and present, saying without words that he was not alone, that his grief was witnessed, that Claire mattered. Emma held his hand and felt the weight of shared grief settling between them, a recognition that transcended the strangeness of sitting beside someone she had met only hours ago. She took a shaky breath and spoke through her tears. "My grandmother has been my Claire, the person who held my hand through everything. When my parents died and I was lost and terrified, she held my hand. When I had nightmares, when I failed tests, when I got my heart broken the first time, when I didn't know how I'd pay rent, she held my hand." Her voice trembled, but she kept going, kept holding his hand as she spoke. "I'm terrified of losing her. I'm terrified that I'll get to Boston and she'll already be gone, that I'll have to say goodbye to the only person who ever made me feel safe in this world. But I'm also so grateful, so impossibly grateful for every moment I had with her. Every handhold, every lesson, every sacrifice she made so I could have a life." She looked at James directly, seeing him fully, seeing past the expensive suit and the grief and the walls he had built. "Claire held your hand because you made her feel safe. She knew she was loved. And I think, maybe, she would want you to keep living. She would want you to let people in, to hold hands again, to remember that connection is what makes us human." Emma's grip tightened on his hand. "She held your hand to feel safe. Maybe now you need to let someone hold yours." Something inside James shattered. The dam he had built brick by careful brick over 3 years cracked and broke and flooded, and he wept, not the silent tears from moments before, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very center of him, from the place he had locked away and refused to visit because the pain was too enormous to survive. He bent forward, his free hand covering his face, the purple clip pressed against his forehead, and he cried for Claire, for his marriage, for the man he used to be, for 3 years of isolation and numbness, and refusing to feel because feeling meant drowning. Emma held his hand through all of it, this stranger who had become something more, and she let him break because sometimes breaking is the only way to heal. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Boston Logan International Airport, and Emma felt the plane begin to tilt downward, beginning the journey back to Earth. James had composed himself, wiping his face with his hands. And there was something different about him now, something lighter despite the redness of his eyes, as if crying had released a pressure valve he didn't know he had been holding closed. He looked at Emma with a clarity that hadn't been there before and made a decision that surprised them both. "Which hospital is your grandmother at?" he asked. Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Mass General." "Why?" "That's near my hotel," he said, which may or may not have been true but suddenly didn't matter. "I have a car service picking me up. Let me take you there." Emma shook her head immediately, her instinct to refuse help as automatic as breathing. "No, I couldn't. You've already done so much, and I can take the train. It's not a problem." "Emma," he said her name with gentle firmness, the way you might speak to someone you cared about, someone whose well-being mattered to you. "Let me do this, please." There was something in his eyes, a need that matched her own, and Emma understood that this wasn't just about her, wasn't just about helping a stranger. This was about him remembering how to reach out, how to connect, how to hold on instead of letting go. She nodded slowly. "Okay, thank you." The plane descended, and Emma's anxiety spiked again, her hand reaching for his without thought. And James took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they had been doing this for years instead of hours. They held on through the landing, through the bump and screech of wheels on runway, through the deceleration that pressed them forward in their seats. When the plane finally stopped at the gate, James pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice measured and calm. "Marcus? Cancel the board meeting." "Yes, all of it. Reschedule for next week. Something more important came up." He hung up before his assistant could respond, before he could second-guess himself, and looked at Emma with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. The car was a black sedan with leather seats that smelled expensive, and Emma sat in the back beside James, feeling acutely aware of the difference in their worlds. But he didn't seem to notice or care. He gave the driver the address to Mass General, and they rode through the streets of Boston in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have shared something profound. When they arrived at the hospital, Emma reached for the door handle, but James was already getting out, holding the door for her, following her into the fluorescent-lit lobby without being asked. "You don't have to come in," Emma said quietly, worried she was imposing, worried she was taking too much from this man who had already given her so much. "I know," James said simply, and kept walking beside her. They took the elevator to the 6th floor, cardiology. And Emma's heart pounded with fear that had nothing to do with enclosed spaces. They found room 612, and Emma paused at the door, gathering courage, and then pushed it open. Margaret Walsh lay in the hospital bed, looking small and frail, her white hair thin against the pillow, oxygen tubes in her nose, but her eyes were open and alert, and they lit up when she saw Emma. "Oh, my girl," Margaret breathed, and Emma rushed to her side, taking her grandmother's papery hand in both of hers, tears spilling over. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm here." Margaret's gaze drifted past Emma to James, standing awkwardly near the door, and her eyes sharpened with the perception of someone who had lived 83 years and learned to see what others missed. Emma turned and gestured to him. "This is James. He's a friend who helped me get here." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come closer, James. Let me see you." James approached hesitantly, and Margaret looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. "Thank you for bringing her to me," she said softly, then turned to Emma. "Give me a moment alone with my granddaughter, dear." James nodded and stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him. Margaret squeezed Emma's hand with what strength she had left. "That man waiting outside has the saddest eyes I've ever seen," she whispered. "But when he looked at you, something in them changed. You brought light back to them, sweetheart. Don't let him disappear." 6 months later, on a spring evening in Seattle, the Claire Hartwell Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research opened its doors for the first time. The building was modern and filled with light. And inside stood Emma Walsh, wearing a dress the color of twilight and a purple butterfly clip in her hair, the same clip that James had carried in his pocket for 3 years until he had given it to her one quiet evening and told her that Claire would have wanted her to have it. Emma was enrolled in nursing school now, her tuition paid in full by James despite her tearful protests, her insistence that she couldn't accept such a gift. He had taken her hands and said simply that it was what Claire would want, that his daughter had loved helping people, and this was a way to let her keep doing that. Emma had helped him build the foundation from nothing, had sat with him through late nights as he poured his grief into something constructive, something that honored his daughter by helping other children like her. She had been there when he called his ex-wife Catherine for the first time in a year, when they met for coffee and cried together and began the slow work of forgiving themselves. Margaret was there tonight too, recovered beyond what the doctors had predicted, sitting in a place of honor with color in her cheeks and joy in her eyes as she watched her granddaughter and the man who had become so much more than a stranger on a plane. James stood beside Emma now, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, their fingers intertwining the way they had 100 times since that first terrified grip during takeoff. He looked lighter now, the shadows in his eyes not gone but softer. And when he smiled at Emma, it was real. Sometimes the most profound connections happen in the smallest moments. In a simple request from a scared girl to a broken man on an airplane neither of them wanted to be on. Sometimes holding someone's hand through their fear is exactly what you need to find your way out of your own darkness. Sometimes strangers become lifelines and broken hearts. Remember how to beat again. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Be kind to the strangers you meet. Hold their hand if they're scared. Listen if they need to talk. You never know what battles they're fighting or how much your small act of compassion might change everything.